We began discussing last week the very important connection between the Passover and the communion. And we talked about the fact that when Jesus partook of this meal, the two were one. And we talked about the fact that one was transformed into the other, so that the Passover that they had been celebrating for 1,500 plus years in that moment was transformed into what we have participated in for almost 2,000 years. And then we also talked about the fact that one was a mere shadow of the other. That the Passover, as huge of a celebration as it's been throughout history, and as critical and important as it was to the Jewish people of that time, it was merely a shadow of what we celebrated this morning. But we talked about also the fact that at the core of both the Passover and the communion is the call to remember. We looked at Deuteronomy 16 last week as the conclusion of looking at Deuteronomy as a book of reminders, and he says, remember, as you partake of the Passover, remember the deliverance from bondage that I brought to you and that I rescued you from this bondage. And of course, in the communion, what did Jesus say? Do this in remembrance of me. And so in that moment that the Passover of remembrance is transformed into the communion, both are rooted in that idea of remembrance, and both enact, as we talked about, the physical emblems in order to ensure our remembrance. Because when we participate in things physically, we remember them. We could just talk about things, we could just think about things, we could just meditate on things, but we have these emblems, these physical things, just as in the Passover, so in the communion, to participate physically in these things so that it makes it real to us, because we are physical beings. But as we closed last week, we talked about the fact, and kind of just made passing reference to the fact, that the Passover had over time been adapted prior to Jesus' time into what is referred to as, even to today, the Passover Seder. And the word Seder is just simply a Hebrew word which means order. And so the original Passover, when God ordained it, he just simply said, have a lamb, have unleavened bread, and have bitter herbs, and that was it. There wasn't any order, there wasn't any ceremony, there wasn't anything of how do we do this, and what process should we do, and what should be involved in it. And so over time, from the original institution of the Passover, after the deliverance from Egypt, the Jewish people created this order, this Seder, this process, in which carried on until Jesus' time, and is pretty much, I haven't heard otherwise, is pretty much identical to a Seder if you were to go to today. As some of you have gone with us every year, we go to, or if you've been a Passover Seder on your own, that order that they do even unto today is pretty much identical to the one that Jesus did and had been adapted. And so the practice of the Seder is especially clear when we look at Luke's account. If you want to head over to Luke, just want to really spend some time looking closely at Luke, because Luke's account brings out the Seder, the Passover order, clearer than the other gospel writers. And again, the purpose of Luke is not to highlight the Seder, but we see it incidentally in looking at it. And one of the first things you notice in Luke's account is in verse 10, when Jesus is getting ready to prepare for the Passover. He told them about this guy in verse 10, when you have entered the city, a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house in which he enters, and then from there you will go partake of the Passover. That pitcher of water was a part of the Seder. And again, those of you who have participated in the Seder, you remember that one of the first things you do is you pass around the table this pitcher of water, and you have a bowl, and you pour the water over your hands and wash your hands, and then you dry them. And the purpose of this pitcher of water was to purify yourselves purify your hands metaphorically, purify your person to get ready for what you are about to partake in. Now, of course, we understand from John's account that Jesus took that pitcher of water and the tradition of washing of hands, and he took it not a step further. He took it like across the country further. He washed their feet, which was the pinnacle of debaseness and shame, and just, be pretty much the same as if I was to wash Jeff's feet. That's a scary thought, and Jeff would probably let me. That idea of washing of feet, it was very, and so Jesus took this in the Seder, this idea of washing the hands, and he abridged it into the washing of the feet. But the other thing you notice in Luke's account that you don't see in the other accounts is you see the two cups. You notice in verse 17 that he took a cup, and then you notice again in verse 20 he takes another cup. And the reason that is that in the Seder there were actually 4 cups of wine. And these 4 cups were named after this passage I have there, Exodus 6. And what they did is they took each of these statements in Exodus 6, I will statements, and each of those represented a different cup. So the first cup that was a part of the Seder is referred to as the cup of sanctification, based on this first statement in Exodus 6, I will bring you out from the burden of the Egyptians. Now, sanctification is a fancy word which simply means to set apart. And the idea of this promise and the idea of this first cup that they would partake of, that they would drink of, was the idea that God made a distinction between the Egyptians and the Israelites, which is a beautiful thing. That here were all these human beings in one place, but God distinguished, and he set apart, and he sanctified, and he said, these people, one here, one there, one over here, one family here, one here, he set them apart to be distinct. And that's an important thing to understand, because if you walk into a mall at Christmas time with a flood of people, I don't know who are believers and who are not. Do you? You might have an idea. There's some signs. But God has sanctified us. Even though we live in Egypt, and even though we're among Egyptians, God has sanctified us and distinguished us from the rest of the world. And so that first cup was simply the cup of sanctification to celebrate the fact that God distinguished us from the Egyptians, from the world. Now, the second cup is the cup of deliverance, based on the second statement. I will rescue you from their bondage. This second cup is the cup in verse 17 that Jesus partook of, and it was, again, the process of this Seder. Several things had happened prior to this that Luke doesn't mention, but the second cup was the cup of deliverance, and Jesus is partaking of the second cup as part of their Passover. Now, following this cup, just a little break here, an intermission, following this cup would be the breaking of the bread in the Passover Seder, which we see in verse 19, and then they would eat the meal, and which we have reference to in verse 20. And so far in Luke's account, we have the first cup, we have the second cup, and then we're going to see the breaking of bread and the supper. But staying in line with what we're talking about with the cups, then there was a third cup. Later in the Passover Seder, there would be this third cup. Now, this third cup, again, is based on the third statement he makes in Exodus 6. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm. And the third cup is what is referred to as the cup of redemption. Now, it is not a coincidence that this is the cup that Jesus took and said, this is the blood of my new covenant. That he took the cup that to them was the idea of redemption, that God purchased them by his blood from slavery. And Jesus takes that third cup, which was to them the celebration of God purchasing them from Egyptian bondage, and he takes that cup and he says, this is the blood of my covenant, the blood by which I have also purchased you, do this in remembrance of me. And then the fourth cup, as a part of the Seder, is the fourth promise. I will take you as my people, and I will be your God. And it was referred to as the cup of hope. I will take you as my people, and I will be your God. I don't know of any more hopeful of a statement than that. Do you? That the creator of the universe has spoken aloud. And he says to even Aaron and to us, I have taken you. You are mine, and I am yours. And so that was the cup of hope. Now, after these, coming back to after the second cup in verse 17, you have the breaking of bread. And the breaking of bread, again, if you've been to a Passover Seder, a modern Passover Seder, you remember they break it. And Jesus also broke the bread and gave thanks. The breaking of the bread was a part of the Seder. It was an intentional. In fact, they would break one half smaller than the other half. And they would break the bread not exactly in half, but one would be smaller and one would be larger. And the breaking of the bread was to remind them of the brokenness that they face in slavery, the affliction that they endured and suffered in Egypt. And so this breaking of the bread was, you could hear the cracking of it. It was to remind them of the cracking of the whip, of the bondage and the slavery that they endured. And Jesus takes that bread and he says, and he breaks it also to remind us of the affliction that we were under the domain of the wicked one. But what blows me away, and several of you brought this up in our small groups this last week, it's unfathomable to think about. And I like that video because if you notice it, they tried to reflect the idea that as Jesus broke that bread, in the idea of the affliction that they suffered in Egypt and the affliction that we suffered under the domain of Satan, when Jesus broke that bread, it was a reality that he would be broken. Not had been broken, something that happened in the past, but he broke that bread as a reality that within a few hours, he would be broken for us. And that's profound. It's profound to even have to anticipate. Those of you who have surgeries coming up or have had surgeries or things or things that are tough that you have to face, the worst part of it is the anticipation of it and the waiting and the imagining how bad it's going to be. And fortunately for us, most of the time, it turns out to be better. We over-exaggerate it. Praise God. But in this case, Jesus couldn't have over-exaggerated it. And as he broke that bread physically, it was a reality that while not a bone was broken, according to prophecy, his heart, his soul, and his body would also be broken for us. So after the breaking of bread, you have in verse 20 the reference to the supper. And it's after the... he also took the cup after the supper. Now, if you know anything about the Passover, you know that it was a feast. In fact, it was a whole lamb per family, and they were commanded to eat as much of it as possible. So you've got this whole lamb. I'm picturing, the gyro stands where you go to the mall and you got the gyros and you got that monstrous piece of meat and they shave it off. And, you get the gyro and it's just like a teeny little slab of that giant piece of meat. They would take that giant lamb per family and partake of it as a feast. In fact, so much so that when we read in 1 Corinthians 11 that this feast that they were partaking of in the Passover, now communion, was so massive that an entire church was capable of getting full on it and getting drunk on it. And so there was this massive feast that was a part of the Passover. And in fact, early documents of the first century of the early church refer to the communion supper as after you have had enough. After you are full, they made this reference. Now, I imagine most of you have taken communion like I have for land's sakes, I don't even want to know how long it's been. That's a scary thought. Some of you have even taken it longer than I have. And I have never in my life, not once, ever left this place after taking of the communion and felt like I was full. Have you? No. In the early church, the communion was such that this supper that was a part of the Passover and now was a part of the communion was such a feast that he says, after you are full, then move on and go. In fact, Jude and Peter refer to this feast as the love feast. That it was this massive feast that they partook of during the communion all the way up until 150 A.D. And it was in 150 A.D. that the problem that took place in Corinth had become such an issue that they retained the meal, they just moved it to Sunday night. And so they would still partake of the communion, and they just separated the meal and moved it up to a different time. But this idea of the Passover meal, this massive feast, was a part of it until the middle of the 2nd century. But again, because of the abuse that we read about in 1 Corinthians 11, they stopped doing it, but for 100+ years, that was the practice of the early church, and they referred to it as the love feast. And really, it's important to point out the fact that the issue of 1 Corinthians 11, the problem that Paul is dealing with there, you remember, of them eating and getting drunk and getting full, the issue was not how much they ate. The issue was why they were eating. One ate the meal in 1 Corinthians 11 to get full. The other ate the meal to be filled. One ate the meal as a common meal simply to get full because they're hungry from breakfast and now they're eating lunch. One ate the meal as merely a common meal to get full. The other ate the meal to be filled with the presence of Jesus Christ and the remembrance of what the Passover and the communion is. And I would argue that our practice of sipping from the tiniest microscopic of cups and partaking of this pinch of bread takes away from the significance of what the Passover was and what the communion should be. Because both the Passover and the communion were a feast of celebration. And so this practice that we've had, overreacting to what happened in Corinth, overreacting to the nth degree, that now we just take a little pinch and a little sip, we're missing the significance of the fact that we, as we partake of the communion, are celebrating. And when I celebrate, I like to eat. Now, I know I'm not alone in that. There might be a few of you that can't relate to that. I don't understand you. You're a different breed. But for the rest of us, I remember when we had a practice back in San Diego, whenever there was a baptism, we would go to, not Farrell's, it was like Farrell's, but a place like that, and we'd order, when we did go to Farrell's, we'd order the zoo. which is like 50 scoops of ice cream, and there'd be like 20 of us. It was a celebration. It was rejoicing. It was saying, God, thank you for this feast, for this love feast, which celebrates and reminds us that you delivered them from Egypt, and you delivered us from the domain of the diabolical wicked one, that we were in affliction, we were in bondage to sin, and yet you rescued us. Now, maybe we can do that with our pinch and our sip and still get a sense of it. As long as we understand what it was intended to be. And it was intended to be a feast, not to get full, which it certainly was abused throughout history, but it was a feast to remind us of the power and the beauty and the glory of what Jesus did at the cross in filling us. But lastly, we see a passing reference in verse 21 to the dipping of the bread. And of course, when you turn to Mark's account in Mark 14:20, it refers to Jesus turned to, and they asked who was going to betray him, and he says, the one who has dipped his bread into the bowl. And so in the Seder at this point, they would take part of the bread that was broken, and they would dip it in this bowl of apples and spices, and it was a sweet mixture to represent the sweetness of their deliverance. And that was a bowl in which Jesus said to Judas, or of Judas, that he would take the bread and that he would dip it into the bowl, and the one who dips into the bowl would be the one who would betray him. And so you see all of these things, especially in Luke's account. You just see glimpses of it. But what you see is the idea that the Passover that the Jews celebrated for 1,000+ years, which was a remembrance of the deliverance from bondage that they experienced miraculously, Jesus transforms it into the communion that we also were delivered from bondage miraculously. And we partake of it so that we will remember. But I think it's interesting as we close that Judas, in Luke's account, was not the only betrayer at the scene. In fact, while the Lamb of God is breathing his last breath, the disciples, verse 24, are arguing as to who is the greatest. And Peter is denying that he's going to deny him. And Judas, of course, is heading out to sell him for 30 pieces of silver. And again, as we talked about Jesus breaking the bread, and the fact that as he broke it, he understood the significance that as I'm breaking this bread, this is the reality that within a few hours, I am going to be broken. And in the same way, as Jesus partook of that lamb, he understood that he was the lamb. And he was the lamb who would face slaughtering, not for his sin, but for the betrayal of all of these people around him. That is, someone was talking about this week in our small group when Jesus washed the disciples' feet. The fact that he washed any of them is significant. The fact that he washed on the disciples' feet, who he knew was going to turn on him, and they were busy arguing. The fact that he washed Peter's feet, knowing that he would betray him and lie about him, and knowing that Judas would betray him for 30 pieces of silver, he washed their feet. And in the same way, he partook of this supper, knowing that he would face wrath on behalf of these people. And that he would also face wrath on behalf of Aaron Lee. because he had my name when he did it. And he had your name. If he knows how many hairs are on your head, he thought of you as he partook of that feast and as he suffered. And I love what Paul said, even when we were still sinners, Jesus Christ died